You know, going back, first of all, I want to thank Jerry Lips and his wonderful family for making this all possible. And the next thing, you know, our lives are truly fate, time, and circumstance. All of us. You know, we can't control to whom we're born, when we're born, and all of the things that go on at that time. You know, the one commonality I've learned as a physician is all our blood is red. That's truly the same thing. I was fortunate enough to be born and had a daddy that was a World War I pilot. He was one of the first American bomber pilots that actually flew over German lines. And of course, I was born in 1921, and my daddy was one of the greatest individuals in my life. I always wanted to fly. And in 1927, he bought a Waco GXE. It had a 90 horsepower Curtiss OX5 engine in it. And I can remember riding in the front when he'd have me strapped in, and I couldn't even see out. And then gradually over time, I grew up, of course, so that I could see out. And then pretty soon, I was able to fly. On my 14th birthday on June 9, 1935, my daddy sold me in Attleboro, Massachusetts, in his 1927 Waco GXE. And that started me. I've been a pilot ever since. And along the way, I wanted to learn to build the airplanes. And my choice actually in schooling, and I was fortunate enough to have grown up we had 5 grades in the same school, and I was able to skip by the time I got through about 4 or 5 grades. And then, of course, World War II was coming along. I was ROTC, like a lot of kids my age, and I took aeronautics, and that was before the days of aeronautical engineering. And then, of course, I was called up shortly after the war started out, and it looked as if I started with MTD. They sent me down to Eastern Airlines down in Atlanta, Georgia, to learn to fly and get my ATR, actually, and fly in the DC-3s. And of course, at that time, I remember the day war started, I was riding co-pilot on Eastern going up to Midway up in Chicago, and got back down to Atlanta, and I had orders to report to Fort Devens. And Fort Devens was infantry, and I figured, oh my God, I've been called up in the infantry, and here I learned to fly. But anyhow, we got it straightened out, and I was assigned to Maxwell shortly thereafter. And then they sent me to Central Instructor School down in San Antonio, and so on. And then the Ferry Command came along, and I was lucky enough not to end up in the troop carrier, but I got into the Ferry Command. And that was a great experience. I was technical air training officer, and I got to fly everything they had. I guess I'm the oldest helicopter pilot. That was June 1943, and the R4 Sikorsky in Bridgeport, Connecticut. There were 5 of us, I think, that got checked out at that time. And helicopters, I still think, are great, but fixed wings also are great. But I've had a wonderful life, and the Ferry Command, as I say, I got to fly about everything. And from like P-51s, the A-36, right up to the P-82. And we used to say we were jockeys of all and master of none. Now, Bob, of course, was the real master. We were jockeys, and I certainly was a jockey. But I've had a wonderful time flying the various aircraft in my lifetime. And then during World War II, one of the problems we had, we were limited 28,000 feet, and then we ran out of oxygen, so to speak, with the oxygen breathing systems we had, which were free flow, like those things that drop down in the airplane, you know, and they say you put on, you don't see any oxygen in the bag, you know, it's supposed to be there. Well, anyhow, we like to have oxygen in the bag. Then as we got going, quite by accident, I was introduced to an early demand breathing system. It was a German system, in fact, in ferrying an airplane that I brought back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The only problem with it says demand, but you had to suck your guts out to get any oxygen. As an engineer, I figured, hell, I can do better than that. So by the time I got back, I ran out of oxygen somewhere across the North Atlantic. By the time I got to Wright-Pat to deliver the airplane, I swiped the breathing system out of the rear seat. This was a JU-88. One seat was forward and one seat was back. So I went back to Long Beach, which was my home station. I had access to the machine shop and so on. And I took the regulator and I said, well, I can make that a little better. But the damn thing was metric and we had SAE. So the threads and nuts and bolts didn't fit very well. But anyhow, I worked it on out and I got it so that very easy, it worked very, very well. And I had a flight surgeon there that was a good friend of mine. In fact, he was 61 years old at the time. He'd been through the School of Aviation Medicine with Dr. Armstrong at the time. He'd also been through submarine medicine in New London, and he was a walking dictionary. And I had developed the breathing that was pretty good. Well, I was quite proud of that. And he said, well, the problem is you got to have pressure. He said, you know, it's just breathing in isn't going to answer it. He said, to get oxygen in, you got to have pressure. And he said, you've got to fix it so at about 25,000 feet, it's got to start forcing that oxygen into the lung. So I took one of the regulators and I put a breathing pressure head on it. So at 25,000 feet, I had a lanoid that would swell up. And as you went up, it would start to push it in. It came in easy, but boy, you had to really push out hard. And he says, that's the idea. That's what we want. And I said, yeah, but you'll wear yourself out. Well, pretty soon, you didn't wear yourself out. And then we developed it, and we kind of tested it. But the only problem was March Field was our nearest chamber, and it only went to 25,000 feet. So we couldn't check anything out at 28,000 feet. So Dr. Halsey decided, well, we take a new B-17. And at that time, we had the turbochargers come out on the B-17, the B-24, and the P-38. And probably they'd go to 35 or 40,000 feet, but we couldn't because we ran out of gas, so to speak, at 28,000 feet physiologically. So we decided we took a brand new B-17, and we were going to check out our system. And I'd made several prototypes that worked pretty well, and I took a mine safety appliance gas mask and made a face mask out of it, and so on. That worked pretty good. So I had a combination. So we decided to test it in a B-17 and go up to altitude. But we said, well, how do we know we're going to be hypoxic and so on? So we went up to 10,000 feet, we wrote our name. And then we took and went up to 15,000 feet, wrote our name, and back to 10. And that morning we worked all the way up to 30,000 feet and got back down to 10,000 feet, absolutely legible. Well, we were excited because it meant we weren't drunk, we weren't hypoxic. So then what were we going to do with it? And over probably the next 3 or 4 months, we made a number of flights on new B-24s and B-17s. So then we decided, well, gee whiz, what are we going to do? By rights, I should have taken it back to the Air Materiel Command at Wright Pat. But I remembered flying some of the nice airplanes back, like boosted ailerons and stuff we had like that. And the engineers back there, you know, they didn't think it was so damn good. But I guess that was the not invented here syndrome I learned later. So anyhow, what happened was we decided, well, I'd take it down and show it to Dr. Armstrong. And I said, well, Dr. Halsey, you know him, make an introduction. He said, well, hell, I don't know him that well. So when I had a P-51 delivery to Newark, from Long Beach into Newark, the weather was lousy on the northern route that time, so I had an excuse to go down to Randolph Field. So I got up about 2 o'clock in the morning, landed at Randolph, and I was fortunate the doctor was in, so to speak, and I got to meet Dr. Armstrong. And I showed him what I had, and he brought several other people in and said, well, you know, show us what you're doing. And he breathed on it, and he says, well, this is just a demand regulator. Oh, my heart went down. Then he says, yeah, but it's a damn good one. So I felt, boy, I'm in. So anyhow, I started to explain the positive pressure and what would happen. And, well, it wasn't quite straightforward. And he said, well, you've got to meet a couple doctors I have down here. And he said they're consultants to the Air Force. And one was Dr. Andrew Cornand at Columbia University, and Alvin Barrick was the other one. One was a cardiologist, and the other was pulmonary. So I got to meet them, and Dr. Cornand said, well, you know, you should go into biomedicine. I said, no, I'm going back with Eastern Airlines. I know I got a job after the war. It looks pretty good. But he said, you better think of biomedicine. And about probably 3 months later, I got about 80 pounds of textbooks from Columbia University. And I remember him saying something about God's engineering. It was physiology. In other words, God's engineering in the body. So what happened was I finally got interested, and I started to read a physiology book, and by golly, I got hooked on it, and I've been a student of it ever since. But anyhow, along the way, I've enjoyed my life. I was able to take and develop oxygen breathing systems, but in other words, all based on pressure that I really learned in the military. And you know, I owe so much to the Army Air Corps and then the Air Force. I was able to work and do it at my own pace and my own time behind the sights, but I could always use the pressure chambers. And for example, as I developed the civil breathing units, I could, at Wilford Hall and Walter Reed, I was able to go in and use their animals to study my equipment, the first patients, and so on. So the military, as I say, I owe so much. And as far as a pilot is concerned, again, I was probably jockey of all and master of none. I certainly wasn't a Bob Hoover, and I want to thank each and